I'm sure we've all shared this kind of experience. You see an accident or a mistake. An accident or a mistake in formation, you're across the room, someone is about to slip or trip, something is about to fall, you just can't get to it in time, the scene kind of slows down. Well, imagine that you're having that kind of experience, but it isn't a household accident, it's a genocide. That's the experience of Reomeo Dallaire. I think we all in this country know of his drama, his tragedy, his ordeal. In Rwanda, for want of 2,000 peacekeepers, some 800,000 people were slaughtered. Lieutenant General Dallaire saved 30,000 of them, but all kinds of strange machinations at the United Nations. Secretary General of the United Nations, instead of augmenting his force, they cut his force, and the rest is history that we're familiar of. Reomeo Dallaire then next spent a period of time in his own despair, but has come back fighting and is now involved in work and in study that has its intent conflict resolution. Lieutenant General Reomeo Dallaire.
Thank you very much. And I'm also glad to see the audience, because I like the eyes and the expression of the eyes and the impact that what I have on you and vice versa that you have upon me as I give you some thoughts and also some experiences, but also, I hope more importantly, projections into the future. I will not speak in my mother tongue, which is Québécois, or my friends in France call 18th century French. I will power talk, as my Marine Corps buddies say, in North American English, which I learned in East End, Montreal, which is predominantly French-Canadian, Catholic, at a Cub Pack. And the Cub Pack, my mom decided that I should learn English, and she's a Dutch war bride, and she came from Holland with 4 languages: English, French, Dutch, and German. In Holland, languages are not political, they're cultural, they're business. Someday, maybe in this country, learning languages will not be political anymore, they'll be cultural. And so on Tuesday nights, I'd go to this English Protestant school, the basement to be at Cubs, and on Wednesday mornings, I go to confession. My Cub sixer, who wanted to win the Caleb's pennant every week, was caught up with this unilingual French-Canadian kid, and so they said, we better teach him something so he doesn't look dumb. And so they taught me a boy's rhyme of the 50s, and I hope it doesn't offend, but it goes something like this. When you're out with your honey and your nose is a runny, don't think it's funny, because it's not. Some of you pick up pretty fast, others a little slower. It took me 1.5 years to figure that out. There's a young sergeant, about 23 years old, and he's arrived in a village in Central Africa on a peacekeeping mission. And he's got about 15 of the soldiers in different vehicles. The village has been recently wiped out. All the humans are killed, slaughtered, chopped up, raped, mutilated. The only thing alive are the odd chicken and the birds singing. Incredible how you can hear the birds with all that silence that's around you. And as they entered the village, there was a chapel, a small church, and people started to come out of the church. Now, that was a complete reverse of where everywhere else, where, in fact, the churches seminaries and monasteries were the ideal places where the extremists would tell people to go because they would respect the fact that they're in these religious areas. And then they would surround it, open up the roof, throw a couple of grenades in, and then slaughter them by machete. And so in a chapel about this size, it would be about 2,000 people. And as you see the sites, you see how they were killed row by row by row, sitting in the rows and just being slaughtered, men, women, and children, priests and nuns. And so the village, these people started to come out, and he went over to them, and they were very happy. The soldiers were there. They were going to be protected. And the sergeant calls up the headquarters to ask for transportation to pull them out of this dangerous area behind other lines under safe UN keeping. Now, as that's going on and the people are coming out more, from one end of the village, there's about 30 to 40 boys, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And they're shooting light machine guns at the sergeant, his troops, and the people they're protecting. The reason they're shooting machine guns is because they've been either abducted out of their homes or their schools, their villages, to be recruited as child soldiers, the girls as sex slaves, bushwives, and some who were totally disenfranchised went willingly into these rebel forces, into these extremist forces, and still do today, and they are considered to be very effective soldiers in the field in this low-intensity conflict area. They're effective because the weaponry is so effective. During the Cold War, we enhanced our weapons and our rifles and so on to the extent that they're very light, very easy to clean, very easy to shoot, and you can become very proficient very rapidly. And so an 11-year-old can kill effectively with these weapons. And so why have adults with all the complications of that? Why not just abduct kids, keep them under control, and simply use them in the battles? And so these 30-odd boys are coming and they're shooting. From the other end of the village, there's about 20 to 30 girls, 11, 12, 9. And behind them, there are other boys, and they're shooting over the heads or between the heads of the girls. And they're shooting at the sergeant, his soldiers, and the people they're protecting. And so the question arises, what does he do? He doesn't have a seminar. He doesn't have hours. He's got nanoseconds because the bodies are only falling beside him. What does he do? What is the ethical thing to do? What is the moral thing to do? What are his references to be able to take the appropriate decision faced by children who are killing and murdering the people under which are his control? And the question then moves to, do you shoot kids? Children kill. Do you shoot children? The sergeant ultimately opened fire. And he killed a lot of kids. And the sergeant today can see clearly, digitally clearly, the moment he gave the order and the bullets flying and the bodies falling. His soldiers can see digitally clear, pulling the trigger, watching the cartridge eject from the rifle, sensing the bullet leaving, and seeing the child's head blow apart. They live with that every day. Was that the right decision? Was it the right decision to protect the people he was supposed to protect? And thus, yes, shoot children? Was there some other option available to him? Like simply not shooting the children and taking the casualties. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an example of this era. the era of conflict. The era that started at the end of the Cold War, when nations who had been held under wraps by the East and the West, where we funded dictators and autocrats to keep control on the people and on the divergence and the differences in the people, to keep them under control so we wouldn't have a problem and would not end up going to World War III over Tanzania or Rwanda. And then when the Cold War ended, we simply told those people, we don't need you anymore, so why don't you sort yourselves out? And that's exactly what they've been doing. Trying to bring democracy, trying to bring human rights, the protection of the individual in these imploding nations, in nations that were artificially created by white men through the colonial era. So we don't need them anymore, so sort yourself out. And this is the era of not the massive movement of armies, even though we have these spurts every now and again, like we saw in Iraq, where they use all the sophisticated equipment for a while. They are exceptions. The Gulf War was an exception. The use of force in parts of Afghanistan are the exception. Because right now, what's going on in Iraq is still a conflict, but it's got nothing to do with classical warfare. They're not identifiable enemies. They're totally integrated. Their beliefs are kamikaze in their expression. They're integrated into their societies. This is no more force on force. For 30 years, I was in the Army and NATO, and I knew every trench. I knew where to put every gun. I knew where they were coming through, and we were ready. The first Russian to come across that East German border, he'd be shot, and then we'd go for how long it needed to wipe them out. Interesting that when I commenced my mission in Rwanda, some of the first officers that came to join me for my headquarters were Russian and Polish and Hungarian. And the Russian colonel came down the stairs of the airplane, and I said, "How do you do?" I said, "You know, for 30 years I've been trying to learn to be more effective in killing you." And he rebutted, "Well, it's funny, we were doing exactly the same thing. Yet we were integrated into this new structure, the UN mission." And so we find ourselves in an era where the old tools are not as effective. In fact, we've been adopting Cold War methods through the 90s in order to meet these conflict areas. We've gone through very stringent debates on whether or not we should be interested or participate in these things. We ad hoc how to meet the challenges of these new peacekeeping missions, these new complex mandates. And we did on-job training, and we took casualties, and we crisis managed, and we failed or we overshot, and on the odd occasion, maybe hit the target. Working with NGOs, I had 156 non-governmental organizations in Rwanda, every one of them independent. Every one of them knowing best how to save the 4 million people who were displaced or injured or refugee. The mom and pop outfit with lots of heart got off the plane, they became a liability the minute they hit the ground. The big outfits with lots of capability, but not much heart, playing to the media because they know that after this crisis, there's another one waiting and they have to get resources for the next one. How do you integrate those capabilities? How do you integrate the new diplomatic tools that are needed to help these nations stabilize in order to give them an atmosphere of security so that they can progress and advance? And that's been the aim. That's what we've been involved with. Advancing our beliefs, our values, our fundamental reference of human rights, the rights of the individual, trying to work from that reference point in this country, a country that is a middle power, a country that masters technology, has a work ethic, has no colonial past, except for the destruction of our First Nations, and a nation who believes in humanity and believes in humans. And that's why we've been in those nations trying to stabilize that. But the tools have not been coming or forthcoming. For 30 years, 40 years if you look at the whole of NATO, we built lexicons on what to do. To attack, to defend, to withdraw. And every of the 19 nations knew exactly what that meant. However, we entered an era in the 90s, which is still ongoing, where the mission, the action verb, the mission statement, is something like create an atmosphere of security. What does that mean? What does it mean? Does it mean I defend the borders while we're demobilizing these troops? Does it mean I watch them? I simply monitor? I provide them some support? What does create an atmosphere of security inside a nation mean? Well, these complex mandates are there because the problems are complex. And as we try to analyze them and look at these missions, we try to simplify them. And you will have generals standing up and say, I need a clear mission statement, I need an entrance capability, I need an exit strategy, and I don't go in if it's not simple. Well, the thing to say to those generals is you're living in the wrong era, because there is nothing simple. These long festering missions or problems will exist and continue to exist and will continue to destroy humanity. You know, that 80% that doesn't count? The 20% that counts, they're sorting things out. Tant bien que mal. But that 80% that's down there, in the mud, in the garbage, in the blood, they really don't count. In fact, are they really human? And one of the questions that is bothering me is a question, are all humans human, or are some more human than others? 800,000 people were killed in a country that had 30% AIDS, with over 1 million injured, with nearly 3 million internally displaced or refugeed out of a population of 8.3 million. All that done in less than 100 days, and I could not keep nor employ 2,000 troops in the field, and yet that is more people displaced, injured, killed, and refugeed than the whole of the 8-year campaign in ex-Yugoslavia. There were 23,000 troops under the UN in ex-Yugoslavia before there was a peace agreement. A peace agreement comes in, there's 64,000 troops. There are still over 10,000 troops. There's still billions of dollars going into ex-Yugoslavia. Nothing of consequence is going into Rwanda. Are all humans human, or some more human than others? 6 months before the genocide started in Rwanda, you had the Mogadishu affair in Somalia. They even made a movie out of it, Black Hawk Down. The fact that over 2,000 Somalis were killed doesn't really come out. 18 American professional soldiers, volunteers, with 70 dead, 72 injured, out of 1.6 million people in uniform in that country, and they pulled out. They got a bloody nose, and they ran, and they left Canadians and Pakistanis and others trying to hold some sort of credibility with the UN, which ended up by being nothing and all being pulled out. The nation couldn't handle those casualties out of the massive capability they had. And why? Well, because it was not in their self-interest. We are dominated by imperial powers who are themselves dominated by self-interest, not by humanity, by self-interest. Do not trust any single nation-led coalition going into somewhere, particularly outside of the UN, to solve a problem and think that that is being done altruistically, that is being done for fundamental human beliefs. For big powers cannot extract themselves from self-interest, and it can include security, perceived security. How do we get them up to the humanity level? How do we get them to the middle powers that guide us when we're conducting those missions overseas? We're conducting those missions overseas not because there's a strategic value for us, it's because we believe that human beings are all the same. There is no difference. We're all human. One of the tricks that was used by the extremists would be to put a bunch of children in the middle of a road. And then when convoys of people who were trying to move between the lines, or food or aid or medical supplies were coming through, they'd have to stop because the children wouldn't move, because if they moved, they'd be shot. And once the convoy was stopped, then the rebels would attack, they would kill people, they would take away the food, the medicine, and so on, and then, of course, carry on. So one day I'm going between the lines, and there's a young 3-year-old boy in the middle of the road. And so we slow down, stop, deploy, look around, bunch of huts on both sides of the road, no noise, nothing. So we start yelling, maybe somebody would respond. No response. Meanwhile, while we're doing that, we look around and the 3-year-old boy's not there anymore. So we start looking for him, and we find him in one of the huts amongst the corpses of his family, most likely. He'd been there for a while. We don't know how he survived the wild dogs, but anyway, he was there. So he took him and put him on the street in front of the vehicle, and I looked at him. And he had his bloated stomach and scars, dirt, flies all around, nearly no clothes on. And when I looked in that child's eyes, I saw my 3-year-old's eyes. They're the same. Both are exactly the same. The circumstances are different, but they're both exactly the same. They're both human. And it's so in that context of whether we of the haves will continue to advance and throw scraps at the have-nots and consider that we're advancing humanity, or do we want to ponder, in fact, that humanity is all of humans, and there's got to be a reassessment of how we perceive how we're doing in the world and our position as a middle power in regards to the human individual rights, human rights, child rights, the ability of other peoples to live, to grow, to permit their future and their future children to be able to advance. I will end. I am currently in uniform. Of course, I got this all of a sudden, but anyways. This is my uniform. This is a tie by Save the Children, who are with UNICEF frontline troops in many of those countries regarding war-affected children. And what I'm trying to do, which is an ethical problem, and the idea, if I can call it that I am searching for help, is that I am going to countries like Sierra Leone. I even went into the favelas in Rio de Janeiro where they're fighting, the children are fighting wars, outright wars with the drug trade, going to those countries, into the rebel camps, and I'm trying to convince the rebel leaders that children are not effective soldiers. And the ethical problem I have is that when I debate that with them, and they come along a way, the next question from them is, okay, but what is effective? And after you argue a while to try to convince them that they should stop, then you're faced with this need for an alternate solution. Can I, in fact, convince them that there is something at least as effective or more effective than the children, and thus extracting the children out of the force, and still feel that I'm doing the right thing? Am I on a morally correct route? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I'd like to leave you with. Thank you. May I say one word? You give a, am I still on?
Yep.
You give a microphone to a general, and we're not ready to release it. And coming to what this is, I was reading the stuff, and it seemed like a lot of revolutionary ideas are coming out of that. So a general in a group of revolutionaries is nothing to worry about. Colonels in a revolutionary group, you got to worry about that. I should like to leave, as I do as often as I can, with two things, if I may. First, the Canadian people in uniform are doing the most righteous, if I can use that term, correct mission that can be given to military, is advancing the plight of humanity with as many peace tools as they can gather. And so they hope that when they get these missions, although being terribly abused by this government, that when they get those missions, the people of this country will support them. And secondly, if they come back in body bags or in pieces, that they and their families be treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. Thank you very much.